so I can get my microphone close. Lord, may the words of my lips and the meditations of my heart be always acceptable in your sight, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. In the fall of 2010, a young white supremacist moved into campus housing at New College in Sarasota, Florida. Derek Black, the son of a KKK Grand Wizard, had been homeschooled from a young age, learning reading, writing, and white supremacy rhetoric from his parents. At age 21, he already had a radio show and had spoken at white nationalist conferences around the country. Things went well for him at college at first. Worried about backlash and about making friends, he hung out with classmates in his dorm, not sharing anything about his past or his extracurriculars. He kept a low profile, and then his second semester studied abroad. While he was abroad in Germany, a post appeared on the school message forum. "Do you know this man?" A picture of himself stared back, and his white nationalist background was laid out for all to see. The thread was full of what you would expect: speculation, questions, hate messages. He returned to school in the fall to impolite hand gestures and quiet distance, except for one student, Matthew Stevenson. Matthew had known Derek from their freshman year together. They watched movies together in their lounge. He was the only observant Jew on campus and made a habit of inviting all different sorts to Friday Shabbat. Derek, ostracized and frankly lonely, agreed to come. He brought a bottle of kosher wine and joined a diverse mix of students for dinner. He was quiet at first, and those who attended were instructed by Matthew not to challenge his views or bring them up. Matthew invited him back the next Friday, and he accepted. This is an unusual story. It's kind of unusual enough. The son of a KKK Grand Wizard as an awkward, lonely human dropped into a liberal arts college campus. It sounds like the setup of a true crime mystery or maybe a weird comedy. You have to wonder about his resilience and mental state that he didn't just pack his bags and leave, honestly. But the more remarkable piece of the story is the behavior of Matthew, who saw somebody who should have been his enemy and invited him to dinner. It doesn't come naturally, as illustrated so surprisingly by this lesson for today. So we enter the story with Jesus, again, saying something that takes off the Pharisees. They have just confronted him because the disciples are not following the hand-washing cleansing rituals in the temple. And Jesus replies with a tough lesson about purity and defilement, saying, and I'm paraphrasing, basically, all of this ritual and religion is worthless if you are defiling yourself by the ugly things in your heart. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles, but what comes out, Jesus says. As usual, Jesus presents a scathing critique of religion that doesn't put its money where its mouth is. That was kind of his thing. Then the disciples, having chewed on this, move on to their next location. So, I had a professor who called this showing your exegetical underpants. But there's some important background that I need to go through. So, this history is helpful. First thing to know is that about 5 chapters back, Jesus had explicitly instructed the disciples that their job is not to be sent to the Gentiles, but that their mission was to the lost of the house of Israel, other Jews. So Jesus is journeying with the disciples now to the region of Tyre and Sidon, which is not a predominantly Jewish area. It's a fairly mixed region. The text says that he encountered a Canaanite woman. Anybody who's familiar with Mark's account might remember that the same story is there, but Mark calls her the Syrophoenician woman. Syrophoenicians were Gentiles or outsiders, but the phrase is a bit more neutral. In Matthew's account, this woman is identified as something that would immediately ping the hearer to a whole bunch of assumptions. It has a loaded history. You can kind of think about this as the relationship between, like, if you describe somebody as a rural person from the Appalachian area versus a hillbilly. It had a connotation. It's not a very nice descriptor, and it pulls on a long history. Canaanites weren't just the people that were ethnically different or lived in another region. These were the same people that lived in the city of Jericho. People that had a long and messy history of warring, the Gibeonites, other sort of tribal folks that Israel was fighting with over their history. So this woman was identified not just as an outsider, she was identified kind of as an enemy. So this woman of an enemy people approaches Jesus. And the first thing to note is that she immediately identifies him, not as a teacher or a prophet, but as Lord, Son of David. She's acknowledging his messianic line. Then she goes on. My daughter is tormented by a demon. Now, having just finished a sermon about how words and actions matter more than ritual purity, you would expect that Jesus would be like, Beloved, your daughter is well. That is not what happened. Jesus' first response is kind of shocking. It's a figurative, like, do you guys remember this from the 90s, talk to the hand? He completely ignores her and keeps on walking. But as any parent to a sick child would, she ignores the social convention in this obvious blow-off and continues yelling after him until the disciples start to complain about it. They're like, Jesus, do something about this lady. So Jesus says, I'm going to make a statement, and says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In other words, not you. Ignoring this, she runs up and kneels before him. Lord, help me. Jesus again rebuffs her with maybe the cringiest line in the whole New Testament. It is not fair to take the children's food and give it to the dogs. Excuse me, what? Where is the all are welcome Jesus that we know? Who said that? Did he really just liken her to a dog? You should note that dogs at this time were not lassie, by the way. They were sort of like low status animals that were associated a lot with scavenging and not being very clean. The funny thing, and like sad funny, not ha-ha funny, is that the woman's not even really shocked by this. She immediately snaps back. Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the table. And when I read this, I almost imagine Jesus' slow blink as he is kind of smacked with realization and then says in shock, Woman, great is your faith. And her daughter was instantly healed. This is a tough text. Did anybody else go like, ooh, while hearing that? Yeah. Christopher always seems to leave me doozies like this. I need to have a word with him. He's like, I'm going to go on vacation at that week. One interpretation of this text, which I've heard in sermons many, many times and honestly don't like, is that Jesus is just testing this woman. And as a reward for her great faith, her daughter is healed. I don't like that. I don't think that Jesus or God does like rude or vaguely mean things in order to test our faith. Maybe my interpretation is a little bit heretical, but I want to think a little bit about human brains when we approach this text. So some of you know that I have a master's in psychology from like a million years ago. And so when I read about bias, I'm like, ooh, this is interesting. We make decisions based on these things called heuristics. So they're like mental shortcuts. You know how a baby sort of learns like doggy, and then every animal with 4 legs is a doggy for a long time before they start sorting into like cats and horses and tigers. It's because they don't have the categories to put things in, so they just put all things that look kind of similar into one category. And we do this all the time. It's a shortcut, and it's a normal cognitive shortcut that we take. Otherwise, we'd be encountering new things every single day with no idea how to make sense of it. So when we meet new people, we have this like pattern or template in our head, and immigrant is a thing that means something, and we categorize it, right? Homeless means something. Democrat or Republican or old or young or a student, all of these things are categories. And the way that we perceive those categories is informed by how we're raised, who we encounter, sometimes our trauma or shared history. So Jesus grew up a Jew, a minority in a vast empire full of people that were not particularly friendly to them. And I personally think if we take his humanity seriously, his human brain developed categories and assumptions like they do. Now, of course, Jesus doesn't work exactly like we work, and I think that his reaction speaks to that. But I think that if we think about Jesus as having a human expectation and response, we can look at this text a little bit differently than just like all-knowing God testing somebody's faith. So after preaching this wonderful sermon about defilement and cultural cleanliness, I don't know, it kind of feels like God the Father chuckled and was like, okay, son, hold my communion wine. I don't pretend to really know the mind of God, but I think at the very least, this text is a reminder that what Jesus just preached about is really hard. That even Jesus sometimes could be challenged by having to look at people beyond the way that his brain wanted to. So this woman approaches and says, hey, I know who you are. And I know that God, your Father, has enough healing and love that even those outside your people can access it. Now that is a statement of faith. And Jesus is gobsmacked. Not only did she profess that he is Lord and the fulfillment of that promise, she also dared to remind him of something true about God that can be really hard to live out. I personally think his declaration that the woman's faith was great wasn't him being like, good job, you passed the test. It was Jesus being genuinely transformed by the reality of who his heavenly Father is and who other humans are. Jesus met the Father incarnate in her, saying, look at my humanity and look at the brokenness of this world. And when Jesus reoriented to this truth as the Son of God, it allowed that world-changing abundance to do what it does best and heal the world and heal her daughter and maybe heal a little of that broken relationship between two old ancient enemies. So to circle back to the Derek Black story. Derek attended Shabbat with his new friends for quite a long time before he started to re-examine the biases that he had been taught. They didn't even try to confront him. This was something that Matthew said when he first invited him. He sort of coached the other folks at the dinner, like, don't fight with him. That's not what we're doing here. Instead, they came together in relationship. The relationship is what changed him and opened up those categories. Over time, those dinner companions weren't just exceptions to a rule. They became the rule that we are all humans, we are all people. And he came to understand how wrong his preconceptions were. In July of 2013, he officially disavowed the white nationalist movement. It started with an invitation to be known. Now, like I said, this is a tough text. And I think it challenges us in several ways. First, I think it's really important to remember not to proof text, because scriptural context and historical background matter a lot in how we read and understand Scripture. I think it's also an important reminder that getting caught up in assumptions doesn't mean somebody is inherently being evil or bad. That maybe even Jesus wasn't above falling back onto his perception of his mission and the cultural context that he was raised in. But the most important thing for me was that this enemy woman became a vehicle of revelation. She challenged Jesus to really see her, and Jesus changed. Reality changed. Maybe we should head into every encounter we have with the question of how this human is bearing the light and revelation of God. That changes our interactions. and ultimately it changes us. When we see each other face to face, something broken inside us and the world heals. The woman's great faith was, in a sense, a repair between these long-warring peoples, but it was also a literal healing. It was a removal of a demon that was tormenting a child. I wonder what else can be made well by our radical humanizing of those around